Hi, so this is a basic and brief introduction to the Argupedia project. And if you notice at the beginning of this document, which I will also share, there are 4 key references, right? So the basic idea of this project is that you've got a fair few online debating platforms, right, where members of the public can post arguments and opinions and discussion. But there's no way in which the public are guided in how to structure arguments in a rational way, firstly. Secondly, how to be guided in determining what kinds of arguments are appropriate as a way of challenging another person's argument. And thirdly, these existing platforms like Kialo, DebateGraph, Reddit, etc., also don't provide a formal way of evaluating the status of arguments, which are winning, which are losing, which are more preferred, which are less preferred, etc. So the idea of Argupedia is to use schemes and critical questions, and references 3 and 4 in the list give you some links to these, what are called schemes and critical questions. The schemes are general templates in which one constructs arguments, right? So an example in reference 3 is what's called the argument for action, right? And this says, in circumstances S, do action A, which will achieve goal G, which will promote value V, right? So imagine you are a user of the system and you want to submit an argument advocating, supporting that some action should take place. You could select from a set of schemes, in particular choose this action scheme, okay, and then be invited by the application, by Argupedia, to provide values for these variables S, A, G, V. And when you provide values for these variables, effectively then, you construct an argument for the action you have in mind. So for example, you might want to submit an argument saying that one should lock down the whole country because of the COVID virus pandemic, right? So you might submit such an argument, and you would add so basically what you want to do is say, okay, well, given that the circumstances are S, so you provide a value for S, which could be, for example, there is a pandemic. There is a pandemic. Okay, then you provide a value for the action variable A. So A equals, we should lock down. So that's the action that this argument is providing some support for. Okay, so this is the action that you want to construct an argument in favor of. Okay, by providing values for these variables, and then goal would be reduce spread of virus, and then the value would be public health. Okay, so you provide the values for SAGV, you submit the argument, and this becomes argument becomes available for other people to challenge and criticize. Now, supposing another person comes along and wants to challenge this argument, okay? For each of these schemes, this is just one scheme. This action scheme is one scheme. There are many other schemes. For each of these schemes, there are associated critical questions. So in reference 3, in fact, there are 16 critical questions for this scheme. So an example of a critical question would be, is S true? Okay, so the critical questions are just ways of challenging the argument, but these critical questions refer only to the variables, right? So is S true? is it the case? Does action A achieve G? Okay. Another question is there an alternative action that promotes same value? Okay. So supposing somebody wants to challenge this argument, they can say, I want to challenge the argument, and then they are presented with these critical questions in which the values of those variables, okay, get inherited from the values given here. So let's supposing you, the listener, whoever's watching this video, this short presentation, has submitted this argument. Okay, and I want to challenge this argument. So I ask for a challenge, and I'm given these critical questions. And so, for example, and these are ways of prompting me to think about counter arguments. So, in particular, if I'm presented with this question, basically that's presented to me as the question: is there is a pandemic? Okay, true. Or does lockdown achieve goal reduce spread of virus? Okay. All right. So supposing I want to challenge this argument by addressing this question: does lockdown achieve the goal of reducing the spread of virus? Okay. So supposing I say, well, I click on this question because this is the way in which I'm going to challenge this argument. I can then provide another argument, okay, that actually provides an argument. I can choose another scheme, and so construct an argument that actually challenges this argument using this critical question. Okay, so let's supposing I choose a scheme what's called the argument from expert opinion. E is an expert in domain D. E says T is true or false. Therefore, T is true, false. Okay? So, we've seen the question that I'm interested in addressing. So I'm interested in challenging this argument by querying whether lockdown does indeed achieve the goal of reducing the spread of virus. Right? Now, let's say there is some expert, call it public E equals. So I can construct an argument, right, which by providing values for these variables. So E equals public health department at, I don't know, say King's. All right? And the public health department at King's say that T equals lockdown reduces spread is false. Right? So what I can do is I can construct an argument, I can provide values, E equals public health department King's, and the statement T is lockdown reduces spread is false. Right? So I can provide values, so I now provide an argument, okay, that by supplying values for these variables, and that argument is an attack on this action argument because it's questioning the assumption in this action argument that lockdown achieves this goal by essentially providing an argument using another scheme which says, in fact, lockdown does not achieve the goal. Okay, so let's call this argument A. Let's call this argument B. Now we change focus somewhat and look at these look at what's called Dung's theory of argumentation. So in a Dung framework, in Dung's theory of argumentation, the reference is there, we have arguments that are organized into a graph. Okay, so you might have A. Okay, so this graph, so you've got a directed graph in which you've got arrows between nodes. The nodes are arguments, the arrows are attack. So we can see from this example that B, argument B, attacks A. Okay, now let's say a third person logs in, looks at this argument here and wants to challenge it. They can again challenge it by referencing one of the critical questions for this argument. One of the critical questions is what E says consistent with other experts? Okay, so they can address that critical question by constructing another argument, maybe using exactly the same scheme. So they might, for example, reference some other expert, let's say Public Health England. So E prime equals Public Health England, right? And Public Health England actually make the opposite statement. You know, they declare that lockdown reduces spread is actually true. Okay, so somebody else constructs this, just like in this case. Another person uses the expert opinion scheme to construct an argument that references some other expert, E prime, who declares something that conflicts with what this expert E says. Okay, so we now have effectively an argument C that attacks B. Right? Now, in fact, because B and C, B is an argument referencing expert public health kings that says some statement T is false, that lockdown reduces spread is false. C references another expert that says lockdown reduces spread is true. So these two arguments actually, they in some sense attack each other because they are making claims for contradictory statements. Right? So we now have another argument C, okay, that attacks B and B attacks C. So what I'm trying to get across is that as users use these schemes in critical questions, they effectively provide values for the variables in the schemes, challenge arguments constructed by providing values for these variables, and challenge these arguments using critical questions. And effectively, they build up this framework of attacking arguments, a Dung framework. Now, one can then declare or evaluate which are the winning arguments at any given time by applying a labeling algorithm that determines which are the winning arguments. So in a simple case, right, the labeling algorithm, so supposing I have an argument X that's attacked by Y, which is attacked by Z. Now, the algorithm notices that Z is not attacked by anything, so it's winning. It then says, well, look, Y is attacked by a winning argument, so it must be losing. Okay, so that's somewhat confusing because I've got X here and X here, but these are arguments, right? And this is winning. Let's call this winning, losing. Now, the argument X, although it's attacked by an argument Y, all of its attackers, in particular Y, are losing, so X is winning. Okay, so this is essentially the idea of the project. Users come along, they log into this Argupedia, they use these schemes, argument schemes, to construct arguments by providing values for these variables. They can then attack arguments using the critical questions. In so doing, over a period of time, a number of users implicitly construct a framework of this kind, and this framework can be evaluated using an algorithm that determines what are the winning arguments at any given time. And that, I mean, this project can be evolved in many different directions, and I've just given you a very kind of quick overview of the basics, but that's the essence of this project.